All right, so let's go ahead and work through this algebra quiz review on solving equations by taking square roots and completing the square. In the first section, we're going to solve each equation by taking square roots. So if I look at number 1, 4m squared equals 1. First, I need to get rid of this 4, so I need to divide both sides by 4. And this gives me m squared equals 1/4, which as a decimal is 0.25. And then I don't want m squared, I want the square root of m squared, which is m. So I need to take the square root of each side. So m equals positive or negative radical 0.25. And the square root of 0.25 is 0.5. So m equals positive or negative 0.5. So that makes our answers. M equals positive 0.5 and m equals negative 0.5. All right, next example, number 2, 16n squared equals 36. So I'm going to divide both sides by 16. And this gives me n squared equals 36 over 16 simplifies to 9/4. And 9/4 as a decimal is 2.25. Then I don't want n squared, I want n. So the square root of n squared is n. And then that means I need the square root of 2.25. So n equals positive or negative radical 2.25. And the square root of 2.25 is 1.5. So n equals positive or negative 1.5. Which means my two answers are n equals positive 1.5 and n equals negative 1.5. All right, next example, b squared minus 1 equals 15. So first we have to get rid of this negative 1. We need to add 1 to both sides. This gives us b squared equals 16. Now I don't want b squared, I want b. So the square root of b squared is b. And so that equals positive or negative radical 16. And you should already know that 16 is a perfect square. So b equals positive or negative 4. So our two answers are b equals positive 4 and b equals negative 4. All right, for our next example, we have 9n squared minus 4 equals 12. So first we need to add 4 to both sides. This gives us 9n squared equals 16. And then we need to divide both sides by 9. And this gives us n squared equals, and 16 divided by 9 rounded to the nearest hundredth is going to be, because it's 1.7 repeating, so let's go ahead and round it to the nearest hundredth, which is going to be 1.78. So it's actually approximately 1.78. And again, I want the square root of n squared, which is going to be n. So n is approximately positive or negative radical 1.78. And the square root of 1.78 rounded to the nearest hundredth is going to be, n is approximately positive or negative 1.33. So my two answers are n is approximately 1.33 and n is approximately negative 1.33. All right, next example, 49x squared minus 4 equals 0. We need to add 4 to both sides. And we get 49x squared equals 4. And then we need to divide both sides by 49. And we get x squared equals, and 4 divided by 49 is approximately 0.8. So then x is approximately positive or negative radical 0.8, and the square root of 0.8 is, again, it's not a perfect square, so it's going to be x is approximately positive or negative 0.28. That's if we round it to the nearest hundredth. So our two answers are x is approximately 0.28 and x is approximately negative 0.28. Okay, number 6 here, we have 16n squared plus 6 equals 70. Step 1, subtract 6 from both sides. This gives us 16n squared equals 64. Then we have to divide both sides by 16. And we get n squared equals 4. So we don't want n squared, we want n. So n is positive or negative radical 4. And we know that 4 is a perfect square. So n equals positive or negative 2. So our two answers are n equals 2 and n equals negative 2. All right, so in this section, we're going to solve each equation by completing the square. So if we look at number 7, p squared minus 12p plus 27 equals 0. Normally, you want your equation set equal to 0, but not when you're completing the square. Because what you don't want is you don't want a c value on the left-hand side. So this positive 27, I don't want it here. And the reason for that is you want to insert your own c value that's going to make the left-hand side of the equation a special case that you can factor. So we have to take this positive 27 and move it over here to this other side. So now our equation is p squared minus 12p equals negative 27. And now we could insert our own c value that's going to make the left side of this a special case. So how do you do that? Remember, what you're going to do is you're going to take your b value and divide it by 2 and then square that. So our b value is negative 12, and negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6, and negative 6 squared is positive 36. So we're going to add 36 to both sides of this equation. So we end up with p squared minus 12p plus 36 equals 9. And now we can take the left-hand side and we can solve this, or we can factor it using a special case. So p squared minus 12p plus 36 comes from p minus 6 squared equals 9. Again, I don't want this p minus 6 squared. I want a square root of both sides of this, right? So this gives me, on the left-hand side, p minus 6, and that equals positive or negative radical 9. And we know that the square root of 9 is 3, so we have here p minus 6 equals positive or negative 3. And from here, we write our two different equations. So one equation is going to be p minus 6 equals positive 3, and the other equation will be p minus 6 equals negative 3. And then we're going to solve. We're going to add 6 to both sides. So in this equation, when I add 6 to both sides, I get p equals 9. And on the second equation, when I add 6 to both sides, I get p equals 3. All right, next example here, b squared minus 4b minus 7 equals negative 2. Again, I don't want this c value here, so I'm going to add 7 to both sides. And this gives me b squared minus 4b equals 5. Then I need to take half of b and square it, right? So what's half of negative 4? Half of negative 4 is negative 2, and what is negative 2 squared? It is positive 4. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. We get b squared minus 4b plus 4 equals 9. So now we can do our special case factoring of the left side. So b squared minus 4b plus 4 comes from b minus 2 squared, and that equals 9. I want the square root of both sides. So I'm going to get the square root of b minus 2 squared is b minus 2. And that equals positive or negative radical 9. We already know from the last problem the square root of 9 is 3. So we have b minus 2 equals positive or negative 3. And then we have to write our two equations. So one equation, b minus 2 equals positive 3, and the other equation will be b minus 2 equals negative 3. And then we solve. Add 2 to both sides here, and I get b equals 5. And over here, when I add 2 to both sides, I get b equals negative 1. All right, next example here, a squared plus 6a plus 8 equals 3. We need to get rid of this c value here, so we're going to subtract 8 from both sides. This gives me a squared plus 6a equals negative 5. Then I'm going to take half of 6 is 3, and 3 squared is 9, so we're going to add 9 to both sides. And this gives me here a squared plus 6a plus 9 equals 4. Then we can get the special case factoring of the left side. A squared plus 6a plus 9 comes from a plus 3 squared, and that equals 4. Then we're going to take the square root of each side, so this gives me a plus 3 equals positive or negative radical 4, and we know the square root of 4 is 2. So we have here a plus 3 equals positive or negative 2, and we have to write our two separate equations. So one equation is going to be a plus 3 equals 2, and the other equation, a plus 3 equals negative 2. Then we solve both sides. So I'm going to subtract 3. And on the left, I get a equals negative 1. And I'm going to subtract 3 here. And on the right, I get a equals negative 5. All right, so looking here at example number 10, we see 5n squared plus 10n minus 40 equals 0. We can take this negative 40, move it over to the other side. This gives me 5n squared plus 10n equals 40. And if I look carefully at this equation, I notice everything can be divided by 5. So I'm going to just take this entire equation and simplify it by dividing it by 5. So this gives me n squared plus 2n equals 8. Now we can go ahead and take our b value, take half of that. Half of 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. This gives me n squared plus 2n plus 1 equals 9. And then we can factor the left side. N squared plus 2n plus 1 comes from n plus 1 squared. That equals 9. We take our square roots. So n plus 1 equals positive or negative radical 9. We know the square root of 9 is 3. So n plus 1 equals positive or negative 3. And we write our two equations. So n plus 1 equals positive 3, and n plus 1 equals negative 3. And then when we subtract 1 to solve, we get n equals 2 and n equals negative 4. All right, number 11, 8n squared plus 16n minus 64 equals 0. Let's go ahead and take this negative 64, take it over to the other side. We have here 8n squared plus 16n equals 64. If we look again, we see that we can divide all three of these terms by 8. So let's do that. Divide this entire equation by 8, and we get n squared plus 2n equals 8. This is looking very familiar to the last problem we did. And again, half of 2 is 1 and 1 squared is 1, so we're adding 1 to both sides. We get n squared plus 2n plus 1 equals 9. Again, we're going to factor the other side. The special case factor of n squared plus 2n plus 1 is n plus 1 squared. That equals 9. Take the square root. So n plus 1 equals positive or negative radical 9. And the square root of 9 is 3. So n plus 1 equals positive or negative 3. We write our two equations. N plus 1 equals positive 3 and n plus 1 equals negative 3. And then again, when we subtract 1 from both sides, we get n equals 2 and n equals negative 4. All right, last example here. So number 12, 3a squared minus 6a minus 2 equals 7. We need to get rid of this negative 2, so we're going to add 2 to both sides. We've got 3a squared minus 6a equals 9. And again, we notice we could divide this entire equation by 3. So let's do that. So we get a squared minus 2a equals 3. What's half of negative 2? Negative 1. What is negative 1 squared? Positive 1. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. And we get here a squared minus 2a plus 1 equals 4. We get the special case factor of the left side, and this gives us a minus 1 squared equals 4. We take our square roots. So this gives me a minus 1 equals positive or negative radical 4. And we know what the square root of 4 is. The square root of 4 is 2. So a minus 1 equals positive or negative 2. And we write our two equations. So a minus 1 equals positive 2 and a minus 1 equals negative 2. And then finally we add 1 to both sides. We get a equals 3. And we get a equals negative 1.